Hey Wyatt, good evening. How are you?
Doing great. Doing great.
Thank you, thank you so much for doing this and joining us for this podcast. I'm sure everyone in the listeners would definitely gain something out of it. For our listeners, I would like to introduce Wyatt Curran to you. Wyatt is um, an HR business partner, principal HR business partner currently at the Blue Shields of California. He has had multiple roles within the HR space, and one of them have been in talent acquisition while working at Capital Group, during which he was involved in high volume recruiting as well. And during our conversation, last couple of calls, me and Wyatt have been discussing about how does high volume recruiting gets impacted by the different technological elements and what can be done to improve. So without further ado, we'd love to discuss that. Um, and once again, Wyatt, welcome. I would like to start from a very, very basic question. If you could please define high volume recruiting for us.
Sure. I mean, from my vantage point, high volume recruiting means you have, well, I'll call them multi-incumbent roles. So you have the same role and you're hiring a lot of people into that same role. So that can be like customer service operations. You have a lot of people that you're trying to fill in the same role and start at the same time often. Many times, high volume recruiting comes in classes. Those classes vary the sizes of them based on the organization size. When I was at Capital Group, we often hired classes of 20, 20 or 30, depending on what the headcount plan called for, because you wanted that class to start at the same time, train and learn at the same time, and then hit the
Right.
floor and call at the same time so they could field calls at the same time. So that's what I say is high volume is not just you hire a lot. So I would differ that from like technology recruiting where you need a lot of software engineers. I would term it the multi-incumbent roles where you have a bunch of people being hired at the same time to do the same job.
Okay. And and do you think high volume recruiting necessarily, I mean, what comes to my mind is a high volume recruiting is typically for roles where there's a high attrition as well. Is that necessarily true, or you've seen that if you just like say for a use case, building a new team entirely, that could also be a high volume recruiting?
Often when you in organizations, the high volume recruiting function, often it is the highest attrition role in the company. And it's mostly because
Right.
of the nature of the role. They don't get paid as much as the other roles. So by nature of that, and they're early in career, so they're not looking to make a career out of, for instance, being in a call center, being in an operations job. So the attrition can come from external attrition leaving the organization, but a lot of attrition in the high volume space comes from people getting internal opportunities within the company. Like
Oh, okay.
they came to start their career somewhere, and a success story is they started their career and they went somewhere else. So if I was like at Blue Shield, I don't want it. Maybe I don't want to be a customer service rep. Maybe I have my eye on some other part of the healthcare company, or in Capital Group, I have my eye on some other part of financial services. And I get into a great company like theirs. I might use benefits like completing a master's degree or something while using their benefits and while I'm working. But the goal isn't usually 15 years later to be answering the phones in customer service. It's to be some other
Mhm.
role. So you'll get the external attrition is high. They're looking for money, but even if you have low, Capital Group had lower attrition than the market and call centers, but they had a lot of attrition because a ton of them got internal jobs, and that's something you have to celebrate. But it also means you have to hire a lot of people to backfill their spots.
Got it. So basically, this is if I were to just build a very very vivid picture in my mind, these are roles which are a are are quite a lot, right? Like in general, they're like one of the biggest chunks of roles in the organization. B, these roles have a very high churn. And when I say churn, this could be either moving out of the company or moving into a different role. So when we think about it, it looks like we have to set up like a factory to get a constant incoming folks in. How do you, or what are the challenges? Because I assume while this role is comes in bunches and in lots, let's say, it would still require a lot of efforts as well as diligence to get them in, right? Like you can't just let anyone in, anyone who has a college degree, you get them in. How does that process differ in terms of the talent acquisition process for a high volume versus a not so high volume or a low volume recruiting?
What I find differs is the profile you're looking for. People think when you're hiring for a technology role or a financial analyst role, a lot of people are going to agree on what good looks like for that role. You're going to look for specific things on their resume that you could tell
Hmm.
another person, even if they had never recruited for that role before, look for this, and we're probably going to get success. In high volume, because it's an entry level role, it's really hard to sift out resumes. Who do you sift out? And in the interview process, who isn't going to make it? It's what does good look like in a high volume role is harder because you'll find that your best people, and often interviewers and sourcers will make assumptions about what good looks like, usually based on some thing they had in their head. I hired this guy or I hired this girl, they were really good, and then they kind of just protract that forward into the future and assume it's going to work again. But I remember going through resumes when I was doing a project in high volume recruiting and just looking at the backgrounds of who were rated really highly, just performance ratings. They were all over the place. Some of them were from McDonald's, some of them had worked at Starbucks,
Hmm.
some of them had been in call centers before and liked taking phone calls. It was really hard to pay, and it differed by region because some were more college graduates, some didn't have college degrees, and that depended on, we what part of the country you were in or where that specific call center was. Really hard to find out what good looks like from a background perspective. Whereas I think in other roles, technology, you kind of know what you're looking for. And when I think of
Correct.
technology roles, they'll have you whiteboard and say, write a piece of code. I want to see if you know what you're doing. It's hard to get that on the high volume side. And you're also balancing selling the company with letting them know what this job looks like in reality. Because a lot of the churn that happens in high volume roles happens right in the beginning when they go like, oh,
Right.
I'm answering 80 calls a day. Like you were serious. So you'll often give interviewers a script like, I need you to tell them like a realistic job preview. You're going to be answering 75, 80 calls a day. Do you understand that? Your breaks are going to be managed, and you just give them a preview of this is a very structured job. And that is consistent across industries. When you're in a call
Got it.
center and you have tens of thousands of calls coming in, or you have an operations center where millions of pieces of paperwork are coming in, you have to have structured workforce management to make sure all of that gets done timely. It's not just people do it when they feel like it and you track productivity. And some people don't like that. You need to weed them out of the process as opposed to getting fixated on, do they have experience with customer service? Often if they're a go-getter and they're willing to learn, they might have worked at McDonald's and they may not have worked at a call center, but they're a quick learner. I understand what I'm getting into, so I'm not gonna go out after 4 weeks because it's like a bigger, longer work day. So finding what good looks like is very hard in that sense. Just can't see it on a resume. Often hard to decipher it from interviews.
Right. So if like I'm further painting that picture, the job that typically is required by someone, especially for these roles, is a very, very structured. very well defined, right? Like, for example, these are the five different tasks that you have to do in a day, and these are the five different tasks that you will keep doing every weekday. Which means that I guess from an attitude perspective, you need someone who is good at doing repetitive jobs, as in because there are different kind of people, right? Like I, for example, if I am doing the same work again and again, I am bound to make more and more mistakes because I tend to become complacent on this. So attention to detail and those kind of things become very important. Is there a particular mechanism that you, am I correct? If yes, then was there a certain kind of mechanism that you could read either from the resumes or from the interviews that could, project this signal for a particular person?
I didn't, I can't say I became the expert at it. I mean, you get really signals from where I went into customer service is I took the stance of I'm going to give them a realistic preview. Like I'm going to give them every chance to drop out by telling them what this actually is. I'm going to let them make that decision. And then I'm going to get from them if I can find out if they have the skills that would facilitate a good customer service interaction from like when I call a customer service center, what do I like hearing on the phone? So
Okay.
I would often get that out of their examples. Are they willing to deviate from the norm, or do they just do what they're told every single time, even when it makes absolutely no sense? We all have a experience with that, right? When they're just like, there's just absolutely nothing we can do. And then you get somebody else on the phone and there is absolutely something you can do. I tried
Yeah.
to find the people that understood that there were rules, but then understood where they're like, I can kind of see what you mean. Let's see what we can do because this is a tough interaction for you to go above and beyond. So I just tried to find highlights in that section. Who could just be a star? And then maybe if you pick out a couple of stars, maybe they're not all duds, but at least if you get a couple stars in that class, it's good for the company and it's good for that class, just
Right.
somebody that can be a leader. So I looked for stars like that. And I never got to this point because it was a rotation that I did high volume recruiting and revamped the process and helped analyze the interviewers. I wanted to get a more automated way, like through an assessment to assess whether they were like conscientious and whether they would show up to work consistently, stuff like that. Would they show
Okay.
up? Would they show up on time? And was there a way that we could just get an assessment? Because it's not a question you can ask. And we did
Right.
ask by them. Interviewers would ask, are you going to show up to work and show up on time?
Of course.
Well, you learn something if they tell you, well, I don't really know. I mean, that's an easy discard, but a lot of people aren't going to say that. So I just wondered if there was a way, and there were some assessments out there. We never got them implemented for different reasons, legal implications and other things. I thought it would be good to have an assessment where, okay, I think they have the baseline kind of, maybe it would be conscientiousness would probably be like the personality trait you look for. They got a baseline of conscientiousness. I can go after the stars, the assessment's taken care of. The baseline level, because the stuff you ask on a baseline level, like we said, hey, are you going to show up every day? That's a big problem in high volume. You go ask anybody that works, it's managed high volume, that's worked on a team in high volume, or has been in HR in high volume. People will just not, they'll stop showing up to work, or they won't come for 3 hours and give no explanation. And that's, you got to manage that. And then you got to hire somebody because of it. It's a team morale thing. And it happens a lot more frequently in those structured jobs than it does in like the exempt level analyst, software engineer, even in HR. You don't get people, they're past that point in their career where they're just going to like not come to work, or and they have different reasons. Some of them are good. Maybe they're looking for another job, they could have other priorities because they don't make that much money.
Right.
But I just look for the stars because the baseline level is hard to assess with just a question. It'd be interesting if you could assess through how they're talking about their experiences, if conscientiousness could be derived by that, by somebody, maybe a robot smarter than me, and saying like, well, their statements here, there might be some dishonesty that we're detecting, and maybe that could be a signal like we shouldn't go this direction.
Interesting. Well, I guess there are signals, and most of the signals are actually hidden in questions. So the way a question is presented and then it is responded, a lot of signals come through this. Sometimes just the question is not right. Like for example, if someone very early stages in their career and we start asking them about uh, how do they reflect on their lives in the past few meetings and so on, it just becomes a little difficult for someone to get that kind of maturity to start reflecting on their experiences that deeply. But my sense is that if we ask very very specific questions and look for those first, as you rightly said, right, like the first few words itself, well, yeah, mostly
Yeah.
that itself will tell you a lot more than going through the entire answer. But yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting problem to have, to be able to predict what in a non high volume is just given, is also something that we're trying to predict as an outcome or as a performance metric for these roles, which is, say, showing up for work every day. Interesting.
Yeah. You know, one
Uh,
question you talked about asking the wrong question. One thing that's super popular because it's early career is,
right,
well, we want to make sure they stay here because we're investing in training them. As you would ask
correct.
them, so that's the outcome. We want to know if they'll stay here and be committed to working for at least some, maybe it's not forever, but some period of time where it's worth it hiring them. And a lot of interviewers would use the question, well, where do you plan on being in 5 years? See, to me, that's the wrong question. You have a person in front
Correct.
of you. I mean, if they're a really high flyer and you're interviewing for a call center job, I mean, first of all, I mean, it's if you're really astute, like if I asked you that in any job interview, you're going to say some version of, I see myself growing at this company and being here in this role because you know what the answer is they want, so you can just spoon feed
Right.
them. But if they tell you they don't want to be in that role, I don't know if that's a bad answer either. Do we want them to be in that same role 5 years from now? Like, I don't know if that's the person that's going to predict success in the role, that they're
Absolutely
like,
not.
I'm just going to be doing this and showing up. I don't know if that also is the right. So I think we're asking them the wrong question. It's kind of an unfair
Yeah,
question
to me the
early in
question
their
is wrong,
career,
right?
right? Like, I don't know where
No
I'm going to be
matter.
in 5 years. That might be a fair answer for them to give.
Correct. I would just say that the question is wrong because either way, it doesn't get tell me anything, right? So it just wasted 5 6 minutes of my time as well as the candidate's time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's I guess that's specific, very very specific to this particular kind of profile. And when you, I'm sorry, I'm just going back a little. So when you told me about the different kind of profiles and experience levels that you got for these roles, what I heard is that trying to sift through CVs for high volume recruiting is actually as good as rolling a dice. You might get it right, you might get it wrong. So how do you actually do it, or do you do it at all?
No, you do it. I mean, I think that every recruiter has a different method, but it's really frustrating. It's really frustrating and a lot harder to do than other roles. I mean, you have to keep them in the pile if they have some kind of customer service experience. That's usually what I did, and I just broadened the definition of customer service.
Okay.
That's what I did. Um, People that, if you have resumes where there's obvious issues, but attention to detail, misspellings all over it, didn't look like a lot of time was put into it, maybe you can discard those because attention to detail, and you might wait. I think we found some correlation that those that were educated with a bachelor's degree were finding more success in that role and when I was there than others. So you would weight that a little differently, but I certainly wouldn't discard anybody that didn't have a bachelor's degree but they had customer service background. I always erred on the side of talking to them if they had some level of experience. The one thing too that was a big sifter beyond the resume, I erred on talking to them because when you talk to them on the phone and the way they present information, that's a much easier knockout than the resume. because their job is going to be to talk on the phone.
Right.
You ask them their first question, hey, how are you doing? Tell me about yourself. And you can't remember what they said after a 20-minute, like a 20-minute, twists and turns, a 20-minute story, and I can't even remember the question I asked. That's an easy knockout for me, right? They're going to be on the phone with a customer. They're going to have to get to the point. You can tell they're not comfortable on the phone. We're not going to put them on the phone with 80 people a day, right? That's usually where I found the knockout most helpful. Just give them a call. Like, if they had some level of experience, get them on the phone and then just screen through that initial screen. I actually found myself screening because of what, especially with phone jobs, if they did processing and they didn't have to talk on the phone, a little harder, but for phone jobs, you could knock them out really quick if they were just very unclear with how they answered a basic question, right? Because we know the questions they're going to get from a customer live are much more complicated than this.
True.
How are they going to communicate when we give them a script or something and they have to see others? That's where I found knocking out based on a conversation was more helpful. And that'd be interesting to analyze what's effective communication, what's not, but it's usually just verbose communication or just generally unclear. Unclear is even worse than verbose, right? Because think of that customer service interaction. You're sitting on the phone. Like that person did a lot of talking. I do not know what any of that meant. You're just going to have to repeat it again. That's going to be bad for your customers. So that came out, and I think that's a fair criticism. We can talk about others that I felt like others were using throughout the process, and I think we talked about this before. I would have loved to be a bug on the wall of that interview on how they made that, how they drew that conclusion, right? Like, which of course we can't do, because right when I sit there and observe the interview, which I did several times, just inherently by being observed, that interviewer is changing his or her behavior. I'm sitting right next to him listening in. Like that something is going different in that interaction. It'd be nice to just be a bug on the wall where they didn't see me there.
True. Can you just give me one sec? All right. No, I mean, all of us would love to be a bug on the wall and know more about what happened in the interview and so on. But one of the key commodity that we are all crunched for is time. And coming back to your original or your way of sifting through, which is making calls, how hard it is to find time, especially in high volume recruiting, because I'm assuming the number of calls or the quantum of calls would just be very, very high as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You bring that up. I remember now, I just thought of this now. One thing that we implemented there was a video interviewing platform where you just gave them questions and they recorded the responses to 2 or 3 questions and you watch the videos. So you didn't do the calls. You were sifting through them by watching the videos and then knocking out people based on that. That actually was a great addition to the process because you didn't need to call them and set up a time and get an interview. You could just send them essentially an email with a link to a video saying, we're inviting you to have this video interview. And then it gives them instructions on how it'll be recorded. And that was at the tail end of that rotation, but a great addition because it helps with the volume you just indicated. I now don't need to schedule. I don't need to worry about if they showed up. If they don't respond to the email and do the video, who cares? You knocked yourself out of that process. So it saved a lot of time. And then you could just analyze from there whether you should talk to them in person. So it kind of shifted the funnel a little bit so you could hire a bit faster than spending your time on the front end, having to schedule a phone call. Very time consuming, right? Like you said, the volume of having to schedule a phone call. Yeah, I can do it. Yeah, I can't. Sometimes they're not ready. Like, would just shock you. People get on the phone.
True.
They're not in this quiet place. They're not ready or stuff like that. And then you're like, well, I've already screened you out. You weren't ready for an interview. So
I'm just thinking about if I have to go through so many recordings as well, that itself is a it is a lot of time that goes into, trying to sift people. But definitely it's more asynchronous rather than having to, work within that time window where you have to call everyone and get that time. That's interesting. And now coming to slightly later part of the talent acquisition, right? So you are out there, you hire like 20 people cohort. Uh, when you're trying to do that, once you've done the sifting, you've done the, let's say, the video interview, how do you try and schedule? Like, I assume if you get a class of 20, you need to at least have, uh, if I assume a 3:1 ratio, then it's about 60 people that get into the interview process. Is that something which is okay as a ballpark, or I'm just
Yeah, I mean,
too high
you
on
know,
that?
let's say it's like 50% rate. Maybe you could, if you had 60, you'd schedule multiple days. It's not far off though. Yeah. Like one and
Right.
two, 1 and 3. You'd hope for one and
Okay.
two. It always fall to 1 and 3. You have to keep
So
scheduling
let's say
more.
if it's best case, it's 1 and 2, and I get 20 candidates into the interview process. Sorry, 40 candidates into the interview process. Now, what does that process look like to be able to meet my targets, get those 20 people in on time so that, the inductions, the trainings, and everything that are further lined up, we are able to meet targets on those. What are the best practices that you've seen, and maybe even the worst practices that you've seen as well?
I mean, I thought the Capital Group did it well. This was
Hmm.
pre-COVID. They
Hmm.
had people come on site. They had them do a site tour, and they would schedule days. So it would be kind of an event, almost like just a site visit event, where they would
Hmm.
schedule multiple days and they would block out a half day on the calendars of people that it agreed to interview. I liked exposing them to the site, what we were like. They even did some mock phone calls in the middle of it so people could hear an actual phone call from a customer. Any way that in the final round you can re-expose them to what the job is actually going to be like again, that is a best practice. 100%, they need to know what this job is like. You can't go into sales mode so much and build them up so much, and then they come and they get to the job and it's so different than what was in their head that they get discouraged and leave. So you have to, like I said, that balance there, critical balance, balancing between selling the company what you have to offer, but also this is actually what the job is going to be like when you get here. So you don't have a mismatch in expectation that's just so much that you're like, first week, this was not what I signed up for. Because that's what you'll find. And you actually, if you sift through Glassdoor reviews of a lot of companies and you find CSRs or a specialist there, you will find a lot of them, they basically state what makes them upset about their job is basically that they're working in a call center. There's nothing that they're doing that you would not expect to be done in a call center. And when you read those reviews, you're like, yeah, I wonder if we could have got them on the front end. I mean, they're unhappy, but this is not an atypical call center environment. Like, we have a ton
Right.
of calls all day, and it's just like when their expectations are appropriate, they can be happy. So that's the one, setting expectations, making it an event where they introduce to the company, but they know what it's going to be like. Now that we're in COVID, COVID taught us that we don't need to do as many things on site. There's a big element of how can you use technology to mitigate people not showing up. So maybe if you block people's half a day, with the site thing, it was kind of like their day was blown remotely. Sometimes their day doesn't need to be. So you could do a mix and match
Hmm.
of both. And that depends on if you have a mostly remote. If you have a hybrid environment, I still think it's a good idea. Go ahead and get them in the office. They're going to be there 2 days a week, even if it's just 2 days a week. I think your office environment's a big sales point to getting them excited and like juicing them up before they go through a long slog of training, which is long, and getting them to meet their cohort that they might be with. So they mingle with other candidates, but some of those candidates are going to be their cohort mates starting at the same time as them and meeting some leaders. That sells the company a lot. Just meeting a person, meeting their manager, potential manager, that can be a big sales point that gets them through a lot of negative experiences at work, that they have that connection even pre-hire. So I think scheduling them on site, unless you're in a fully remote environment, I think having on site scheduling, it helps with ensuring that they're in the location where they can commute to the office. Got a practical concern, but also helps sell the company. It is tough because even companies that are hybrid 2 days a week, you will find their customer service group, they don't find a lot of value in that group going in the office. You read CEOs online about why they want people in the office, and these are the exact things you don't want customer service people doing. They're talking about collaborating and like talking and whiteboarding and all of that stuff, and you're talking about like a productivity environment. Like you do not want them talking. Like, I mean, at work, it's not like school. You don't say, "Oh, stop talking," but really, if you got them excessively collaborating, you know, the phone volumes are you're gonna need more people to answer the phone. So you'll find a lot of groups, even if they're hybrid environments, certain roles, a lot of them customer service. It's an easy one for that to be remote. But I think there's value in having them come on the site and be sold on the company and culture by being there on the site.
True.
At least pre. I would do that even if you were going to send them remote. I would just connect them that way. I think it would be
Right.
practice.
And in terms of, the setting up of interviews uh, for these high volume, like for example, you would probably need to block away a chunk of time from recruiters, hiring managers as well to be able to make sure that they're aware. And in my sense, if I am a hiring manager who's going to interview like, well, let's say 10 people also, right? Like not the entire 40, but 10 people during a day. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of notes. That's a lot of information to retain and process and provide my recommendations on. How did you guys see that? Like, was it ever a challenge? And yes, if yes, how did you guys address it?
It was didn't have quite the numbers that you're talking about, like 10 people in a day, but you might have 3 or 4.
Okay.
Biggest challenge I saw with it was, so the way I saw it structured at Capital Group is we would do a half day and you would interview the person. Like the one candidate would go through at least 2 people in the day, and they would cover different competencies. So they would have 2 interviews, but then you'd have a lot of candidates that would go through 2 interviews. Now, each one of them would kind of give like, score them on the competencies and whatnot, and whether they would want to hire him. Biggest challenge I saw was the calibration at the end of the day. Okay, who do we want to hire? How that calibration ran was the biggest challenge I saw. We would spend a lot of time on people that, say you had 2 managers and they just had great things both had great things, 2 separate interviews. They both had amazing things to say about the candidate. And we'd talk about them for 20 minutes. Oh, this example was great. Oh my goodness, you should have heard how they're going to be so good in this phone queue. 20 minutes. And I was kind of like, I would observe it and go, the outcome is whether we want to hire them or not. Why did we even start about talking about this? We could have spent probably a minute by saying, you guys are both thumbs up. Is there any reason that anyone else thinks we shouldn't put them in the hiring class, and move on? So we actually, as a part of redesigning the process, it was uncomfortable for them, but I forced them to only collaborate those where there was a disagreement. So one hiring manager said thumbs up, one said thumbs down. Now we have something to talk about. You disagree for some reason, but then I'll get to the second challenge. So that calibration is one. When they disagreed, the reasons they disagreed and what they heard in the examples was always ambiguous. You could tell, like, we would ask more questions about what was happening in that interview. you always got the sense that they didn't remember, they over remembered one thing that was just like stuck out in their mind. We're humans, right? Like you do a 30-minute interview or even a 45-minute, like one thing that a candidate says can just stick in your mind and it almost
That's
colors their
true.
comments about everything else. And like to your point, you just like to be a fly on the wall. Like, is that the only thing they said, or is that the like? Do you have, because you would as caliber as participants, these two people are the only ones that actually talk to the person. But there's probably 7 or 8 other people that are asking questions of you, and it's an uncomfortable environment. I mean, you got to feel for these two. They interviewed them and other candidates. They have to go back in their notes and they're kind of sifting through. Do they remember everything about it? Oh, I remember this or that. And I think because it's so hard to remember, you start to fixate on details that may or may not be relevant.
Relevant,
I
right?
told you that example. They might fixate on they worked for an employer that this guy or this girl had an experience that they hired someone from this employer in the past and they were a disaster and washed out after 6 weeks. So now suddenly everybody that's ever worked at this employer is not good. I think you come up with mental shortcuts because it's so difficult. Like they're the only ones there, they're grasping for information. So they're almost trying to convince you that they're right. I hired them because they were, and they will use buzzwords. Like I don't think that's intentional. I think it's just lack of confidence or I don't know if I'm that confident. I just want people to, I want to sell my side. If my decision doesn't get greenlit, that's going to reflect negatively on me as an interviewer instead of trying to get to the right decision.
I guess that's so. So first of all, the part that you're talking about, which is availability heuristics or availability bias, which is I hired one wrong hire for company X, so everyone from company X now is going to be a bad hire. Uh, very prevalent, and I think absolutely wrong. But all of us have these availability heuristics in our mind that, hey, I've had a bad experience with someone who had a degree from X university. That means I am now suspicious of everyone who has an X degree from an X university. On the other hand, when you talk about buzzwords and all right, I often feel, and maybe this is my own experience. I've done that myself. Sometimes when I have to do like 4 or 5 different meetings in a day, then on top of that, I have to do another 2 or 3 interviews in a day. Things tend to start getting messed up, right? Like if you don't have a proper structure, and even if you do have a very good structure, it's just difficult the amount of writing and information that you have to retain. And then you sort of have made up your mind through one of these biases or heuristics, and what eventually happens is that now I'm using all these buzzwords just to justify my decision because I know what the other person would like to hear in terms of when I say a
Yeah.
yes or when I say a no. And that just comes out, I guess, being in the corporate world or being in corporate America, it just starts happening by itself, right? You get trained for these, right? Your answer should always have some buzzwords and justifications for what you want to do rather than making it more evidence based. But this is my experience and talking to a lot of people and being the bug on the wall for a lot of interviews as well, considering the business that we are in. But yeah, I've seen that people do tend to take I would just say shortcuts, right? Like either mental shortcut or this kind. That's so in case of high volume recruiting, then I see that the problem still when it comes to the interviews stay very much what we have in a non-high volume. The only problem is it gets exaggerated because you have a lot more people to talk to. Am I correct in saying this, or
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
just
it'll exaggerate.
overgeneralizing?
It'll exaggerate. The problem of an interview is just exaggerated and it's amplified by how many people, and then it's also amplified by the deadline imposed by needing to hit the number.
Right.
Every high volume has the class number. We need to hire 20 people. And you will find that number will drive decisions in, like, we have 18 people. Sometimes those last two people didn't meet the same muster as the first two people that got in. That's definitely a thing. And that's not to say anything negative about anybody. It's just you have a goal. Could they do it? I think they could do it. Like, there's a benefit of the doubt. Let's take a shot on them because there's last two people. If you had that same discussion with no number at the top of it, some of these people might not have made it in. If you just said, we want all the people that are the best candidates for it, no matter what the number is. So there's no question. And the ones I've been in, 8, 10 of them, I probably went through 8, 10 classes. I don't remember how many classes. There's no question some of them wouldn't have made it through if the goal wasn't there of 20 people. That's something that's unique, I think, to high volume, because it's so easy to squash when you only have one role. Like, when you see a hiring manager doing it, you can squash it and say, wait a second, maybe this isn't the best person for the role. I know you want to get it hired, but let's go see what we have. Multiply that conversation times 20, you can see that it's going to be a lot more unwieldy to have that same thing. Like, just push it, because the difference in having 15 versus 20, that amplifies down the pipeline of your ability to being able to answer the phones and create a great experience for your customers that you might have as a goal in the future. Reverberates through the months. Okay, now these 5 aren't there. We can't replace them next week. The class starts, and we don't have another class starting until 8 weeks after that. Just way bigger chunks, way bigger delays. So there's a lot of pressure to hit that number.
Like a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
Wyatt, I know we're almost on time, but I just have one quick last thing, if you are okay. It's often said that when you do something very repetitively, you get better at it. Now, high volume recruiting seems like a classic example of that. So do you see, when you start, let's say, hiring, or you start a project for X, the quality of hire that you make at the start is going up? Like, does that hold true for hiring in general? And I mean, the reason I ask specifically in high volume recruiting is because you will be able to see that relatively quickly, because the numbers you're hiring or recruiting. Does it get better, as in a quality of hire gets better over time? And does it continuously improve, or there's a time when it just, sort of stops improving anymore?
The desire for it to get continuously better is there, but it's not a given.
Okay.
There's, at least where I was at, there's probably other companies that are better at it. At least where I was at, that was part of my project in high volume, is there was not a feedback loop that was fed back to the original interviewers of if their new hire worked out or not. However you want to define that. I defined it as attrition within a year. Just simplistic. Okay, did they leave within a year?
Right.
That feedback loop doesn't exist. The interviewers might want it. They just don't get the feedback loop in a consistent way. So would they get better? They will get more confident, and they will get better at some things, like knowing how to probe deeper when they get a bad answer, when they get not a bad answer, but just an incomplete answer.
Mm-hmm.
They will learn how to better build rapport with the candidate. Some things I think get better, but I don't think that it will automatically translate to a better quality of hire, because that person might think they're getting better, but they don't know, they don't have a feedback loop to know. If I don't have a feedback loop, I could be making a mistake and I don't know it because I don't examine myself. I would need a feedback loop of, look, I've recommended 10 people for hire, and 4 of them have left in 6 months, and I might go back to my note. If I had great notes, it'd be great to go back and go, what was my reasoning why I thought they would be good? Could I have caught this? And then I might change I might change how I go about that next interview. Without that feedback loop of how those hires are working out, it's really hard to continuously get better at it. And it depends on what you measure, right? So if you measure, an easy one to measure is just uptake from that final day you just outlined. So that we said the 1 and 2, 1 and 3 on the final day. That's an easy low hanging fruit metric they'll use in the high volume. Okay, we on the final day we had 50 candidates and we'd recommended 50, 25 of them to be higher. That's 1 and 2. That's great. Last time it was only 1 and 3. Now it's 1 and 2. But that's just hiring them. What if you got the 1 and 2 and then more of those people left in a year? That's a critical feedback loop you just missed. You're just measuring the top of the funnel. That doesn't mean anything that you hired them. And if you think about it, it's kind of a perverse incentive to the interviewers to like just, well, we could get to 100%. Maybe we shouldn't interview any of them, just hire all. It'll be at 100%. It's a weird way to think about it, just the uptake.
True.
You need to know that they worked out it by some metric, they worked out, and then use that information to feed back into what questions are we asking, how are we screening them. And then even if you can get it back, that's what I worked on, getting it back to the interviewer level, not to punish them. But like if they were bad or good, it wasn't to praise or punish them, but you could maybe find highlights like, gosh, this person picks winners every time. Can we record
And
their
the other,
interviews or something? What are they doing? I don't know, like, are they doing something different that we don't even train on? And on the other side, what did we miss with this person, like this person or this location? These people are just leaving in droves. Is this controllable? Can we ask something different? Can we connect this star with them because we've just listened to their interviews? I don't know if anybody would ever consent to recorded interviews, but it'd be hugely valuable because sometimes people are just naturally good at things. And when someone's naturally good at interviewing, it's one of those like hidden boxes. No one actually knows what they do. Who sits in on an interview with somebody? It's so uncommon, isn't it? You're a good interviewer. Can I just sit there and listen to you? That's just a hugely uncommon thing to ask. But if you would love to do it with stars, and you'd love to do it where the outcomes are really bad, and like, is there something that candidate said that we could have, or is there something we didn't ask, like based on like a probing question we missed? Because then interviewer training would be specific instead of broad. All interview training is broad.
right.
You would probably agree with that. It's all broad. It'll tell you about building rapport, asking a probing question, making sure that you get outcomes on examples. I mean, there's a million things you can do, but they're all broad, nothing specific. I might not need to build rapport with Canada. I might need something specific that'll make me better.
True. That is so good to hear because I don't know. I'm during this conversation, I heard so many things that we have realized from a lot of other people. So it definitely reemphasizes the faith that we have in the product that we are trying to build. Like asking the right questions, looking for the right signals, training the interviewers, be able to observe, look at what are the differences between the decision of two interviewers. How can we complete the feedback loop in order to improve quality of hire? I guess, yeah, all these are very, very relevant problems. And honestly, whether it's high volume, whether it's not high volume, the the nature of the problem is very similar. The way you solve it might be slightly different, but the nature of problem is quite similar that ways.
Yeah.
But thanks, Wyatt. I know it's pretty late in the evening for you. So thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Yeah,
And I had a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah,
Especially
I had
on the
some fun
subject.
too.
But thank you so much.
All right, appreciate it.
Like,
Bye.